Number 1. Paul Bernardo. Some criminals become infamous because of a single horrific act. Others earn their place in the darkest corners of criminal history through a pattern of escalating violence that reveals something truly terrifying about human nature. Paul Bernardo falls into the latter category. He didn't just commit crimes. He perfected them, refined them, and documented them with a chilling level of pride. And for years, he did it all while wearing the mask of a charming, successful young man that nobody suspected. Paul Kenneth Bernardo was born on August 27, 1964, in Scarborough, Ontario, a suburb of Toronto. To the outside world, his childhood looked relatively normal. His father worked as an accountant, his mother was a homemaker, and the family lived in a comfortable middle-class neighborhood. But behind the curtains of that suburban home, darkness festered. Bernardo's mother was reportedly cold and emotionally abusive, while his father had a violent temper and a disturbing history that included allegations of inappropriate behavior. When Bernardo was 16, his mother revealed to him during an argument that the man he called father wasn't his biological parent. She'd had an affair, and Paul was the result. The revelation shattered whatever fragile sense of identity he'd constructed. Friends and acquaintances from his teenage years would later recall that something changed in Paul after that. He became more calculating, more manipulative, more focused on control. By his early 20s, Bernardo had transformed himself into exactly the kind of person people wanted to be around. He was handsome, well-dressed, and charismatic. He worked in accounting, drove a nice car, and seemed to have a bright future ahead of him. Women found him attractive. Men found him affable. He was the guy who could light up a room, tell a good joke, make everyone feel like they were his best friend. But underneath that polished exterior was something monstrous waiting to emerge. Starting in May 1987, a series of disturbing attacks began plaguing the Scarborough area. Young women were being targeted in the early morning hours as they walked home or waited at bus stops. The attacker would appear suddenly, overpower his victims, and commit brutal assaults before disappearing into the night. The media dubbed him the Scarborough Rapist, and the community was gripped with fear. Police launched a massive investigation, but the attacker was careful, methodical, and seemingly invisible. What nobody knew at the time was that Paul Bernardo, the friendly accountant with the winning smile, was responsible for at least 14 of these attacks. In October 1987, Bernardo met a 17-year-old girl named Karla Homolka at a hotel restaurant in Scarborough. She was blonde, petite, and working part-time while finishing high school. He was 23, confident, and immediately captivated by her. Within hours of meeting, they were intimate. Within weeks, they were inseparable. And within months, they had formed a bond that would become one of the most disturbing criminal partnerships in Canadian history. Karla was drawn to Bernardo's intensity and dominance. He, in turn, found in her someone who wouldn't just tolerate his darkest fantasies. She would participate in them. They fed off each other's dysfunction, pushing boundaries further and further until fantasy became reality. And reality became a nightmare. On December 23, 1990, Karla's 15-year-old sister, Tammy, became their first murder victim. In what can only be described as an act of unspeakable evil, the couple drugged the teenager and assaulted her while videotaping the attack. Tammy choked on her own vomit and died in the early hours of Christmas Eve. When paramedics arrived, Bernardo and Homolka claimed she'd simply gotten drunk and choked. The death was initially ruled accidental. They had gotten away with murder, and that emboldened them to go further. In June 1991, 14-year-old Leslie Mahaffey was abducted after being locked out of her house late at night. She was held captive in Bernardo and Homolka's home in the town of St. Catharines, where she endured unimaginable horror over the course of 24 hours. Everything was recorded on video. When they were finished, Bernardo ended her life, dismembered her body using a circular saw, encased the remains in concrete, and dumped them in a nearby lake. 2 weeks later, portions of the concrete blocks washed ashore. The discovery sent shockwaves through the region. A massive investigation was launched, but once again, Bernardo remained just out of reach. He and Carla even attended Leslie's funeral, watching from a distance as her grieving family laid her to rest. Less than a year later, in April 1992, 15-year-old Kristen French was kidnapped in broad daylight from a church parking lot. She was held captive for 3 days, subjected to repeated assaults, all meticulously filmed, before being murdered and dumped in a ditch. Her body was found 2 weeks later. The community was in a state of panic. Police were under enormous pressure to find the killer. And yet, Paul Bernardo still wasn't on their radar as a primary suspect. He'd been interviewed months earlier in connection with the Scarborough attacks after his name came up through a tip, and he'd even provided blood and hair samples. But due to a massive backlog in the forensic lab, those samples sat untested for over 2 years. While police waited for results, Bernardo continued to operate freely. The case finally broke open in early 1993, but not because of brilliant detective work. It was because the relationship between Bernardo and Homolka began to crumble. He'd become increasingly violent toward her, beating her severely on multiple occasions. In January 1993, after a particularly brutal assault that left her hospitalized with severe injuries, Carla moved out and went to stay with relatives. Afraid of being implicated in the murders and seeing an opportunity to save herself, she contacted a lawyer and began negotiating a deal with prosecutors. She would testify against Bernardo in exchange for a reduced sentence. Prosecutors, desperate to secure a conviction and unaware of the full extent of her involvement, agreed. Carla Homolka received a plea deal of 12 years in prison in exchange for her testimony. It would later become one of the most controversial decisions in Canadian legal history. When police finally arrested Paul Bernardo on February 17, 1993, they found a treasure trove of evidence in his home, videotapes that documented his crimes in horrifying detail. The tapes left no doubt about his guilt. They also revealed that Carla Homolka had been far more involved than she'd initially claimed, but by then, her deal was done. The tapes became the centerpiece of Bernardo's trial, which began in May 1995. The proceedings were heavily restricted due to the graphic nature of the evidence, but what emerged was a portrait of a man who had not only committed unspeakable acts, but had enjoyed them, filmed them, and watched them repeatedly. The jury deliberated for just 9 hours before returning a verdict. Guilty on all counts, including 2 counts of first-degree murder. He was sentenced to life in prison with no possibility of parole for 25 years. But the story doesn't end there. In 1997, Bernardo was declared a dangerous offender, a designation that allows the court to keep him imprisoned indefinitely beyond his minimum sentence. He has applied for parole multiple times and been denied every time. As recently as 2023, his parole hearings have generated public outrage and media coverage, with victims' families and advocacy groups fighting to ensure he never walks free. He remains incarcerated in a maximum security facility, where he will likely spend the rest of his life. Paul Bernardo represents something that terrifies us on a fundamental level: the monster next door. He wasn't some obvious misfit lurking on society's fringes. He was the kind of person people liked, trusted, and invited into their lives. And that's what makes his story so deeply unsettling. It forces us to confront the uncomfortable truth that evil doesn't always announce itself. Sometimes it smiles, shakes your hand, and waits for the perfect moment to strike. Number 2, Carla Homolka. In the history of Canadian crime, few names inspire as much rage, confusion, and debate as Karla Homolka. She's been called many things: a victim, a manipulator, a monster, a survivor. The truth, as it often is in these cases, is far more complicated and far more disturbing than any single label can capture. What makes her story so chilling isn't just what she did, but how she managed to walk away from it with a sentence that many believe was far too lenient. This is the story of a woman who helped commit unspeakable crimes, then convinced the justice system she deserved a second chance. Karla Leanne Homolka was born on May 4, 1970, in Port Credit, Ontario, into what appeared to be a stable, loving family. She was the eldest of 3 daughters born to Carol and Dorothy Homolka, working-class parents who provided a comfortable suburban upbringing. Friends and teachers described young Karla as bright, outgoing, and popular. She did well in school, had a close-knit group of friends, and seemed to have a relatively normal childhood. She worked part-time at a pet store, loved animals, and talked about becoming a veterinary assistant. There were no red flags, no warning signs, nothing that suggested she would one day become involved in some of the most horrific crimes Canada had ever seen. She was, by all accounts, just an ordinary teenage girl living an ordinary life. That all changed in October 1987 when 17-year-old Karla met 23-year-old Paul Bernardo at a hotel restaurant in Scarborough. The attraction was immediate and intense. Bernardo was handsome, confident, and charming, everything Karla found exciting. Within hours of meeting, they were intimate. Within weeks, they were inseparable. And within months, their relationship had taken on a dark and troubling dynamic. Bernardo was controlling and dominant, and Karla, rather than pushing back, seemed to embrace it. She began molding herself into whatever he wanted her to be. Friends noticed the change. She became more secretive, more distant, more focused on pleasing Paul at the expense of everything else. But to the outside world, they looked like the perfect couple, young, attractive, and deeply in love. What nobody knew was that Paul Bernardo was already living a double life. By the time he met Karla, he had already committed multiple brutal assaults as the so-called Scarborough Rapist, a serial predator who had been terrorizing the Toronto area since May 1987. Karla would later claim she had no knowledge of these crimes during the early years of their relationship. But as time went on, she became not just aware of his violent tendencies, she became an active participant in them. And it started in the most unthinkable way possible, with her own sister. In December 1990, Karla made a decision that would forever cement her place in criminal infamy. She wanted to give Paul a twisted gift. She wanted to give him her 15-year-old sister, Tammy. Karla worked at an animal clinic and had access to sedatives used on pets. She stole a bottle of halothane, a powerful anesthetic, and brought it home. On the night of December 23rd, after a family Christmas party, Karla and Paul drugged Tammy's drinks. Once the teenager was unconscious, they assaulted her while videotaping the attack. But something went horribly wrong. Tammy began to vomit and choke. Instead of calling for help immediately, Karla and Paul panicked, tried to clean up evidence, and only then called emergency services. By the time paramedics arrived, Tammy was dead. Karla told investigators that her sister had simply gotten drunk and choked. The death was ruled accidental. Karla attended the funeral, comforted her grieving parents, and played the role of devastated sister. She got away with it, and that was only the beginning. Emboldened by their success in evading suspicion, Karla and Paul escalated. On June 14, 1991, 14-year-old Leslie Mahaffey was abducted after being locked out of her house late at night. She was taken to the couple's home in St. Catharines, Ontario, where she was held captive, assaulted repeatedly over 24 hours, and murdered. Carla was there for all of it. She participated, she filmed, and according to evidence that would later emerge, she showed no hesitation. Leslie's body was dismembered, encased in concrete blocks, and dumped in a lake. 2 weeks later, the remains were discovered. The community was horrified. Police launched a massive investigation, but Carla and Paul continued their lives as if nothing had happened. They even got married on June 29, 1991, in a lavish ceremony attended by family and friends. It was a fairy tale wedding, complete with a horse-drawn carriage, held just 2 weeks after they had murdered a child. Less than a year later, in April 1992, 15-year-old Kristen French was kidnapped in broad daylight from a church parking lot. Witnesses saw a young blonde woman asking Kristen for directions. That woman was Carla Homolka. Once Kristen approached the car, Paul forced her inside. She was taken to their home, held captive for 3 days, and subjected to horrific abuse, all of it recorded on video. When they were finished, Paul strangled her, and her body was dumped in a ditch where it was found 2 weeks later. Once again, Carla was present for everything. Once again, she participated. And once again, she showed no outward signs of guilt or remorse. But cracks in the relationship were starting to show. Paul had become increasingly violent toward Carla herself, beating her on multiple occasions. In January 1993, after a particularly savage beating that left her with severe injuries, including black eyes and broken ribs, Carla left Paul and moved in with relatives. She was hospitalized, and when police saw her injuries, they began asking questions. Afraid of being implicated in the murders and realizing Paul might turn on her, Carla made a calculated decision. She contacted a lawyer and began negotiating a deal with prosecutors. She would testify against Paul Bernardo in exchange for a reduced sentence. Here's where the story takes a turn that still enrages people to this day. Prosecutors, desperate to secure a conviction against Bernardo and unaware of the full extent of Carla's involvement, agreed to a plea deal. In May 1993, Carla Homolka pleaded guilty to 2 counts of manslaughter and received a sentence of 12 years in prison. The deal was done, signed, and sealed. But then months later, police discovered something that changed everything. Videotapes hidden in the couple's home that showed Carla wasn't just a reluctant participant or a battered woman forced to go along. She was an active, willing participant who appeared to enjoy what she was doing. The tapes contradicted almost everything she had told prosecutors, but it was too late. The deal couldn't be undone. Bernardo's trial in 1995 revealed the horrifying truth, and public outrage over Carla's sentence reached a fever pitch. The media dubbed it the deal with the devil. Advocacy groups, victims' families, and legal experts condemned the decision. But Carla Homolka served her 12 years quietly in prison, largely shielded from the general population due to safety concerns. She participated in therapy, obtained a degree, and by all accounts, behaved as a model prisoner. On July 4, 2005, Carla Homolka was released from prison after serving her full sentence. And here's where her story becomes even more controversial. She didn't fade into obscurity. She moved to the Caribbean, then later to Montreal, where she remarried and had 3 children. She changed her name, but her identity was eventually discovered by the media. In 2017, it was revealed that she was volunteering at her children's school, a fact that sparked outrage and fear among parents. Journalists have occasionally tracked her down, and each time, the same questions resurface. Has she changed? Does she feel remorse? Is she a threat? Carla Homolka has never done a full public interview or offered a detailed explanation for her actions beyond what she said during legal proceedings. Some psychologists believe she was a victim of severe domestic abuse who was coerced into participating. Others believe she was a willing partner who manipulated the system to escape justice. The truth may lie somewhere in between, or it may be darker than either explanation suggests. Today, Karla Homolka lives as a free woman under a new identity, raising her children and living a quiet life. Meanwhile, the families of Tammy Homolka, Leslie Mahaffey, and Kristen French continue to live with the pain of their losses. Paul Bernardo remains in prison, denied parole repeatedly, and the public continues to grapple with an uncomfortable question. Did justice truly prevail, or did Karla Homolka commit the perfect crime? Not just the murders themselves, but the ultimate escape from accountability. Number 3. Andrew Peter Garforth. There are some crimes that seem to come out of nowhere, committed by people who, by all accounts, had no history of violence, no red flags, no warning signs. And then there are cases like Andrew Peter Garforth, where the warning signs were flashing bright red long before tragedy struck. The question isn't whether people saw it coming. It's why no one stopped it in time. Andrew Garforth was born in 1963 in Yorkshire, England, into what appeared to be an ordinary working-class family. But behind closed doors, things were far from ordinary. From a young age, Garforth exhibited disturbing behavior, violent outbursts, an obsession with fire, and a troubling fascination with harming animals. These weren't just phases or childhood tantrums. They were warning signs that mental health professionals would later recognize as classic indicators of severe psychological disturbance. His family struggled to manage him, and by his teenage years, Garforth had already had multiple run-ins with authorities. He bounced between schools, unable to hold down friendships or maintain any semblance of normal social interaction. Teachers described him as volatile and unpredictable. Classmates kept their distance. And yet, despite all of this, Garforth remained in the community, moving through life with very little intervention. By the time he reached adulthood, Garforth had developed a criminal record that included theft, assault, and arson. He was known to police, known to social services, and known to psychiatric professionals. He had been in and out of mental health facilities, diagnosed with various disorders, and prescribed medications he rarely took. But the system, overburdened and under-resourced, let him slip through the cracks time and time again. He lived alone in a small flat in Hull, a city in East Yorkshire, where neighbors described him as strange, reclusive, and sometimes frightening. He would mutter to himself in the hallways, leave bizarre notes on doors, and occasionally erupt into fits of rage over seemingly nothing. People avoided him, but no one reported him as an imminent danger. He was just another troubled man in a city full of them. Then came the summer of 1992. On a warm evening in July, a young woman named Lynn Trenholm was walking home from her job at a local cafe. She was 23 years old, friendly, well-liked, and engaged to be married. Her route took her through a quiet residential area, the kind of neighborhood where people felt safe enough to leave their doors unlocked. But that night, safety was an illusion. Andrew Garforth was waiting. He had been watching her for weeks, tracking her routine, learning her schedule. When she passed by his building, he emerged from the shadows and attacked. What followed was a brutal and terrifying assault that ended with Lynn fighting for her life. She managed to scream, managed to attract the attention of a neighbor who called the police. But by the time officers arrived, Garforth had fled, and Lynn was left with severe injuries that would take months to recover from, physically at least. The emotional scars would last far longer. The investigation moved quickly. Witnesses had seen Garforth in the area, and forensic evidence linked him directly to the scene. Within 48 hours, he was arrested at a friend's house on the outskirts of the city. He showed no remorse, no emotion. When questioned by detectives, he was calm, almost detached, as if discussing something that had happened to someone else. He admitted to the attack, but offered no real explanation beyond a vague statement that he felt like doing it. Psychiatrists were brought in to evaluate him, and what they found was deeply troubling. Garforth exhibited signs of severe personality disorders, a complete lack of empathy, and a history of violent fantasies that had been building for years. He wasn't just dangerous, he was a ticking time bomb that had finally gone off. But here's where the story takes an even darker turn. As investigators dug deeper into Garforth's background, they uncovered something that sent chills through the entire community. Lynn Trenholm wasn't his first victim. Several unsolved assaults in the area over the previous 2 years bore striking similarities to Lynn's case. Same time of night, same type of victim, same method of attack. None of the earlier victims had been able to identify their attacker, but now, with Garforth in custody, detectives began re-examining those cases. Forensic technology in the early 90s wasn't what it is today, but there was enough circumstantial evidence to suggest that Garforth had been operating in the shadows for far longer than anyone realized. The system had failed not just once, but repeatedly, and each failure had given him another opportunity to strike. Garforth was charged with attempted murder, grievous bodily harm, and several counts of assault. His trial began in early 1993, and it was a media sensation. The prosecution painted him as a predator who had been allowed to roam free despite countless red flags. The defense argued that he was a deeply troubled individual who had been let down by a mental health system that didn't have the resources to properly care for him. Both sides, in their own way, were right. But in the end, the jury had to decide not whether the system had failed, but whether Andrew Garforth was guilty of the crimes he was accused of. And on that question, there was no doubt. He was found guilty on all counts. The judge, in delivering the sentence, didn't mince words. He described Garforth as one of the most dangerous individuals to appear in his courtroom, someone who posed an ongoing and serious threat to public safety. He was sentenced to life imprisonment with a minimum term of 20 years before he could even be considered for parole. But given the severity of his crimes and the psychiatric reports that accompanied his case, many believed he would never see freedom again. So where is Andrew Garforth today? He remains incarcerated in a high-security facility in England, having served over 3 decades behind bars. He has been denied parole multiple times, with each review concluding that he still poses a significant risk to the public. Reports from prison staff describe him as withdrawn, uncooperative, and showing little to no progress in addressing the psychological issues that led to his crimes. Lynn Trenholm, meanwhile, rebuilt her life as best she could. She became an advocate for victims of violent crime and has spoken publicly about the failures in the system that allowed Garforth to slip through the cracks for so long. This case forces us to confront an uncomfortable truth. Sometimes the most dangerous people are the ones everyone already knows about. Andrew Garforth wasn't a mystery. He wasn't hiding in plain sight. He was right there, documented, diagnosed, and dangerous. And the system, stretched too thin and hampered by bureaucracy, simply couldn't stop him in time. The question that still lingers is this: how many others are out there right now, slipping through those same cracks, waiting for their moment? And what will it take before we finally close the gaps that let people like Andrew Garforth hurt the innocent? Number 4, Wayne Lowe. There's a particular kind of horror that comes with school violence. The violation of a space that's supposed to be safe, the targeting of young people whose lives have barely begun, and the randomness that makes every survivor wonder why they were spared. On December 14th, 1992, Simon's Rock College, a small liberal arts school in Great Barrington, Massachusetts, became the site of one of the earliest modern school shootings in America. And at the center of it all was an 18-year-old student named Wayne Lowe, whose carefully planned attack would leave 2 people dead, 4 wounded, and an entire community asking a question that still haunts them today. Could this have been prevented? Wayne Lowe was born in 1974 in Taiwan and immigrated to the United States with his family when he was young. They settled in Montana, where his parents worked hard to provide opportunities for their children. By all accounts, Wayne was a bright student, intelligent, disciplined, and academically gifted. He excelled in school, played classical music, and seemed destined for success. His family was devout Christian, and Wayne himself was deeply religious, often attending church services and Bible study groups. Friends described him as quiet and reserved, but not unfriendly. He kept to himself mostly, but when he did interact with others, he was polite and respectful. There were no obvious red flags, no history of violence, no criminal record. He was, on paper, exactly the kind of student any college would be proud to admit. In 1992, Wayne Lowe enrolled at Simon's Rock College, a unique institution that allowed students to begin college after 10th or 11th grade, catering to academically advanced teenagers. It was a small, close-knit campus with fewer than 400 students, the kind of place where everyone knew everyone. Wayne arrived in the fall semester and initially seemed to fit in well enough. He was studious, kept up with his coursework, and participated in campus activities. But as the weeks went on, something began to shift. Classmates started noticing changes in his behavior. He became more withdrawn, more isolated. He spent hours alone in his dorm room, and when he did speak to others, his conversations often took strange turns. He talked about guns, about violence, about feeling disconnected from the world around him. Some students found it unsettling. A few even mentioned it to campus staff. But in the early 90s, the kind of threat assessment protocols that exist today simply didn't exist. Concerns were noted, but no serious action was taken. What nobody fully understood at the time was that Wayne Lowe was planning something. In the weeks leading up to December 14th, he had become obsessed with firearms. He ordered a semi-automatic rifle through the mail, a Chinese-made SKS that he purchased legally and had shipped directly to a local gun shop. When the package arrived on campus, it was intercepted by college security. The return address indicated it was from a firearms dealer, and staff became concerned. They contacted Wayne's mother, who seemed surprised and worried. They spoke with Wayne himself, who claimed it was just a gift for a friend. Nothing to worry about. Campus administrators debated what to do. Some felt they should confiscate the package and investigate further. Others worried about violating his privacy or overreacting. In the end, they made a decision that would haunt them forever. They released the package to him. Within hours, Wayne Lowe retrieved his rifle, purchased ammunition from a local sporting goods store, and returned to campus armed and ready. On the evening of December 14th, 1992, Wayne Lowe put his plan into motion. He loaded his rifle, filled his pockets with ammunition, and walked out of his dormitory with a singular purpose. His first target was the library, but finding it relatively empty, he moved outside and began walking across campus, firing at anyone he encountered. His first victim was Nakunyan Saez, a 34-year-old professor and beloved member of the faculty who was simply walking to his car. Wayne shot him multiple times. Nakunyan fell to the ground and died within minutes. Students nearby heard the shots and began running, screaming, trying to understand what was happening. Wayne continued walking, calm and methodical, firing at anyone in his path. He shot and wounded several students, including Teresa Beavers, who was struck in the neck and critically injured. Campus security guard Richard Goodale heard the commotion and rushed toward the sound of gunfire. He was unarmed. Simon's Rock security officers didn't carry weapons, but he ran toward danger anyway, trying to protect the students. Wayne Lowe shot him multiple times. Richard collapsed and died at the scene, giving his life trying to stop the attack. By now, police had been called, and sirens were approaching. Wayne continued firing, wounding more students until he finally ran out of ammunition. When officers arrived and confronted him, he surrendered without resistance. The entire attack had lasted less than 15 minutes, but it had shattered an entire community. In the immediate aftermath, the questions came fast and furious. How did this happen? Why did this happen? And most painfully, could it have been stopped? Investigators discovered that Wayne had left behind writings, journals, and notes that revealed a deeply disturbed young man who felt alienated, angry, and convinced that violence was justified. He wrote about wanting to punish the world, about feeling superior to those around him, about seeing himself as an agent of some twisted form of justice. There were references to his religious beliefs, distorted and warped into something dark. He seemed to believe he was carrying out a righteous act, that those he killed deserved their fate. It was the kind of thinking that would become tragically familiar in the years to come, as school shootings became more frequent and the warning signs more recognizable. But in 1992, this was still relatively new territory. Wayne Lowe was arrested and charged with 2 counts of murder, multiple counts of attempted murder, and various weapons offenses. His trial began in 1993, and it was a media spectacle. The defense argued that Wayne was suffering from a mental illness, that he was delusional and not fully responsible for his actions. Psychiatric experts testified about his psychological state, describing a young man disconnected from reality and unable to distinguish right from wrong. The prosecution, however, painted a different picture. They presented evidence of careful planning, deliberate actions, and a clear awareness of what he was doing. They argued that Wayne Lowe knew exactly what he was doing, that he had made a choice, and that he needed to be held accountable. The jury sided with the prosecution. Wayne Lowe was found guilty on all counts. In September 1993, he was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. The judge, in delivering the sentence, spoke directly to the devastation Wayne had caused. The lives ended, the future stolen, the community torn apart. He described the crime as calculated and cruel, and he made it clear that Wayne Lowe would spend the rest of his life behind bars. But here's where the story takes another disturbing turn. In the years since his conviction, Wayne Lowe has become something that many find deeply unsettling. He's become remorseful, or at least he claims to be. He has written letters to victims' families, apologizing for his actions and expressing regret. He has participated in interviews and documentaries, speaking about his crime with what appears to be genuine sorrow. He has said that he was wrong, that he was confused, that he wishes he could undo what he did. Some people believe him. They see a young man who made a catastrophic mistake and has spent decades reckoning with it. Others see it as manipulation, a calculated attempt to appear sympathetic, to rewrite his own narrative. The families of Nakunyan Sayas and Richard Goodale have expressed mixed feelings. Some have chosen to forgive, finding peace in letting go of anger. Others remain convinced that Wayne Lowe is exactly what he was on that December night, a cold-blooded killer who destroyed their lives and doesn't deserve sympathy. Wayne Lowe remains incarcerated today, serving his life sentence in a Massachusetts state prison. He will never be released. He has no possibility of parole. And yet, his case continues to raise uncomfortable questions about culpability, about mental illness, about the systems that failed to identify and stop him before tragedy struck. Simon's Rock College, now Bard College at Simon's Rock, has worked hard to heal, to honor the victims, and to ensure that what happened in 1992 never happens again. But the scars remain, visible in the memorials on campus, in the stories shared by survivors, and in the absence of two people who should still be alive. Wayne Lowe's story is a reminder that school violence didn't begin with Columbine or Parkland or any of the other names we've come to know. It's been happening for decades, each tragedy leaving behind the same devastation, the same questions, and the same desperate plea: never again. Number 5. Melinda Loveless. Some crimes are so brutal, so senseless, so completely devoid of humanity that they force us to confront the darkest possibilities of human nature. And when those crimes are committed by children, not hardened adults, but teenagers who should still be worrying about homework and weekend plans, the horror becomes almost incomprehensible. On January 11th, 1992, in Madison, Indiana, a 12-year-old girl named Shanda Sharer was tortured and murdered by 4 teenage girls in a crime so vicious that it shocked even seasoned investigators. At the center of it all was 17-year-old Melinda Loveless, whose jealousy and rage would lead to one of the most disturbing cases of juvenile violence in American history. Melinda Loveless was born on October 28, 1975, in New Albany, Indiana, into a troubled home that seemed destined to produce dysfunction. Her father was reportedly abusive, both physically and emotionally, creating an atmosphere of fear and instability. Her mother struggled to protect her children and keep the family together, but the damage was already done. Melinda grew up angry, volatile, and starving for control in a life where she'd had none. By her early teens, she was already exhibiting troubling behavior, explosive temper, difficulty maintaining relationships, and an intensity that made people uncomfortable. She struggled in school, not because she lacked intelligence, but because she couldn't seem to connect with others in any meaningful way. Friends would later describe her as magnetic but dangerous, the kind of person who could draw you in and then turn on you without warning. In her mid-teens, Melinda became involved in a relationship with a girl named Amanda Heverin. It was intense, possessive, and ultimately toxic. Melinda was obsessed with Amanda, and that obsession quickly turned controlling. She wanted to know where Amanda was at all times, who she was talking to, what she was doing. And when Amanda began pulling away, when she started spending time with other people, Melinda's jealousy reached a boiling point. Enter Shanda Sharer, a 12-year-old girl who attended the same school and had recently become friends with Amanda. Shanda was young, sweet, and completely unaware that she had become the target of Melinda's rage. In Melinda's twisted mind, Shanda had stolen Amanda's attention. She had to be eliminated. In the days leading up to January 11th, Melinda began planning. She recruited 3 other girls to help her: Lori Tackett, Hope Rippey, and Toni Lawrence. Each had their own reasons for going along. Some were looking for excitement, some were afraid to say no, and some, like Lori Tackett, were dealing with their own darkness. Together, they hatched a plan to lure Shanda out of her house and teach her a lesson. What started as a plan to scare a 12-year-old would escalate into something far more monstrous. On the night of January 11th, 1992, the 4 girls drove to Shanda Sharer's home. They knocked on the door and told Shanda's parents a story about needing her help with something, convincing them to let Shanda leave with them. Once Shanda was in the car, the night descended into nightmare. They drove her to a remote area, and that's when the violence began. Melinda attacked Shanda with a knife, stabbing her repeatedly while the others watched or participated. Shanda begged for her life, pleaded to be let go, promised she wouldn't tell anyone. But Melinda was beyond reason. The attack continued for hours. They beat her with a tire iron, strangled her, and tortured her in ways that are almost too horrific to describe. At various points throughout the night, they stopped to get food, to clean themselves up, to discuss what to do next, all while Shanda lay bleeding and barely conscious in the trunk of the car. Eventually, they drove to a remote field, pulled Shanda's body from the trunk, poured gasoline over her, and set her on fire. Some reports suggest that Shanda was still alive when they did this, though barely. The girls watched as the flames consumed her, then drove away, leaving her body to burn. They stopped at a fast food restaurant on the way home, ate breakfast, and talked about what they'd done as if it were nothing more significant than skipping class. The next morning, a hunter discovered Shanda's charred remains in the field. The discovery sent shockwaves through the small community of Madison, Indiana. Who could do something like this to a child? The investigation moved quickly. Within days, police had identified the 4 girls involved. Hope Rippey and Toni Lawrence, the youngest and least involved, began cooperating almost immediately, their guilt and horror evident. Lori Tackett remained largely silent, cold, and detached. And Melinda Loveless showed little emotion at all. When questioned by detectives, she was matter-of-fact, almost casual in describing what had happened. She admitted her role, acknowledged the violence, but offered no real explanation beyond jealousy and anger. There was no remorse, no breakdown, no moment of recognition that she had done something unforgivable. It was as if she simply didn't understand, or didn't care, that she had taken a life. All 4 girls were charged as adults with murder, kidnapping, and other offenses. The trials became a media sensation, with the nation watching in horror as the details emerged. The prosecution painted Melinda Loveless as the ringleader, the driving force behind the crime, the one whose jealousy had ignited the entire tragedy. The defense argued that she was a product of her abusive upbringing, a damaged child who had never learned how to process emotions in a healthy way. But the evidence was overwhelming, and the brutality of the crime left little room for sympathy. In 1993, Melinda Loveless was convicted of murder, criminal confinement, and arson. She was sentenced to 60 years in prison, one of the harshest sentences ever handed down to a juvenile offender in Indiana at that time. Lori Tackett received the same sentence. Hope Rippey and Toni Lawrence, who had cooperated with authorities and were deemed less culpable, received lighter sentences. Hope got 60 years with significant time reduced for cooperation, while Toni received a 20-year sentence. But here's where Melinda Loveless's story takes an unexpected turn. Over the years in prison, something changed. Or at least, she says it did. She participated in counseling, earned her GED, took college courses, and became involved in prison programs focused on rehabilitation. She wrote letters expressing remorse, spoke about the pain she had caused, and claimed to have found faith and forgiveness. Psychologists who evaluated her noted significant emotional growth and a genuine understanding of the gravity of her actions. In 2019, after serving 26 years behind bars, Melinda Loveless was released on parole. The decision sparked immediate and intense controversy. Shanda Scherer's family was devastated, outraged that the person who had brutally murdered their daughter was walking free. Victim advocacy groups condemned the parole board's decision, and the community of Madison, Indiana was divided. Some believed in rehabilitation and second chances, while others believed that some crimes are simply unforgivable. Today, Melinda Loveless lives under supervision, subject to strict parole conditions. She has kept a low profile, avoided media attention, and by all accounts, has tried to build a quiet life far removed from her past. She has never done a major interview or offered a detailed public explanation for her actions beyond what she said during legal proceedings. Meanwhile, Shanda Scherer's mother, Jacques Vaught, has become an advocate for victims' rights and has spoken publicly about the pain of seeing her daughter's killer released. Jacques has described the ongoing trauma, the sleepless nights, and the feeling that justice was never truly served. Melinda Lovelace's case forces us to grapple with questions that have no easy answers. Can someone who committed such unspeakable violence as a teenager be truly rehabilitated? Does a person who tortured and murdered a 12-year-old child deserve a second chance? And at what point does punishment become justice? And when does it simply become revenge? These are the questions that continue to haunt everyone touched by this case. Shanda Sharer never got a second chance. She never got to grow up, fall in love, have a family, or live the life that was stolen from her on a cold January night in 1992. And for many people, that's the only answer that matters. Number 6. Lori Tackett. If Melinda Lovelace was the spark that ignited the horror of January 11th, 1992, then Lori Tackett was the gasoline that made it burn. In the brutal murder of 12-year-old Shanda Sharer, Tackett wasn't just a follower going along with someone else's plan. She was an active, enthusiastic participant whose own darkness matched, and perhaps even exceeded, Melinda's rage. While Melinda's motive was jealousy, Lori's seemed to be something far more unsettling. She appeared to enjoy it. This is the story of a teenage girl whose fascination with death and violence would culminate in one of the most horrific crimes Indiana had ever seen. Lori Tackett was born on October 5, 1974, in Madison, Indiana, into what looked from the outside like a stable middle-class family. Her father was a factory worker, her mother a homemaker, and they lived in a quiet neighborhood where everyone knew each other. But inside the Tackett household, things were far from normal. Lori's childhood was marked by instability and dysfunction. Her parents' marriage was troubled, marked by frequent arguments and periods of separation. Lori herself struggled with feelings of not fitting in, of being different from other kids her age. She was intelligent, even gifted in some ways, but she channeled that intelligence into dark places. By her early teens, Lori had developed an obsession with death, the occult, and violence. She read books about serial killers, drew disturbing images in her notebooks, and talked openly about wanting to hurt people. Friends found her fascinating and frightening in equal measure. In high school, Lori cultivated a deliberately dark persona. She dressed in black, listened to heavy metal music, and claimed to be involved in satanic rituals, though whether she actually participated in such things or simply enjoyed the shock value is unclear. She had few close friends, but those she did have described her as magnetic, intense, and unpredictable. She would swing between being charming and witty to cold and cruel without warning. Teachers noticed her intelligence, but were concerned by her preoccupation with morbid subjects. She wrote essays about death and violence, drew graphic images of torture, and seemed to revel in making others uncomfortable. But in the early 90s, before Columbine, and before schools had comprehensive threat assessment protocols, these warning signs were noted but not seriously addressed. Lori was seen as a troubled teen, maybe a bit strange, but not necessarily dangerous. In 1991, Lori became friends with Melinda Lovelace. It was a toxic pairing from the start. Two deeply troubled girls who fed off each other's darkness. Where Melinda was explosive and emotional, Lori was cold and calculating. Where Melinda acted out of jealousy and rage, Lori seemed motivated by something more disturbing, curiosity about what it would feel like to hurt someone. When Melinda began talking about her hatred for 12-year-old Shanda Sharer, claiming that Shanda had come between her and her girlfriend Amanda, Lori didn't just listen. She encouraged it. She suggested ways to hurt Shanda, talked about how they could get away with it, and seemed genuinely excited by the prospect. For Lori, this wasn't about jealousy or revenge. This was an opportunity to act out the violent fantasies she'd been nurturing for years. On the night of January 11, 1992, When Melinda, Lori, Hope Rippey, and Tony Lawrence drove to Shanda Scherer's house and convinced her parents to let her leave with them, Lori was calm, almost cheerful. Once Shanda was in the car and they drove to a remote location, the violence began. Melinda attacked first, stabbing Shanda with a knife while the girl screamed and begged for her life. But it was Lori who escalated things to an even more horrific level. Witnesses would later testify that Lori participated enthusiastically in the torture, that she beat Shanda with a tire iron, that she strangled her, and that she seemed to be enjoying herself throughout. At one point, according to testimony, Lori suggested they should make Shanda strip so they could humiliate her before killing her. This wasn't just about eliminating someone Melinda was jealous of. Lori was turning it into her own twisted form of entertainment. The torture went on for hours. They drove around with Shanda in the trunk, stopping periodically to beat her again, to pour cleaning chemicals on her wounds to inflict more pain. At one point, they stopped at a gas station to buy drinks and snacks, laughing and joking while Shanda lay bleeding and barely conscious just feet away. Lori was reportedly the one who suggested burning Shanda's body to destroy evidence. When they finally drove to a remote field in the early morning hours, pulled Shanda from the trunk, doused her with gasoline, and set her on fire, Lori watched with what witnesses described as fascination. Some testimony suggested that Shanda was still alive, though barely, when the fire was lit. The girls left her there to burn and drove away. They stopped at McDonald's for breakfast, where Lori reportedly joked about what they'd done, making light of the murder as if it were nothing more significant than a prank. When Shanda's charred remains were discovered the next morning, the investigation moved swiftly. Hope Rippey and Tony Lawrence, overcome with guilt and horror, cooperated with police almost immediately. Their testimony painted a devastating picture of the night's events, and both girls pointed to Melinda and Lori as the primary instigators. When police arrested Lori Tackett, she showed remarkably little emotion. She was calm, almost bored, as detectives questioned her. She admitted her role in the crime with chilling matter-of-factness, describing the torture and murder in graphic detail without any visible signs of remorse. When asked why she did it, she offered no coherent explanation beyond saying it seemed like a good idea at the time. Psychologists who evaluated her were disturbed by what they found: a complete lack of empathy, an inability to understand the gravity of what she'd done, and what appeared to be genuine enjoyment in recounting the violence. All four girls were charged as adults with murder, and their trials captivated the nation. The prosecution presented Lori Tackett as every bit as culpable as Melinda Loveless, if not more so, due to the level of violence she personally inflicted and the apparent pleasure she took in it. The defense attempted to argue that Lori was mentally ill, that her fascination with violence was a symptom of deeper psychological problems, and that she'd been influenced by Melinda. But the evidence was overwhelming. The brutality of the crime, Lori's own admissions, and the testimony of the other girls left no doubt about her guilt. In 1993, Lori Tackett was convicted of murder, criminal confinement, and arson. She was sentenced to 60 years in prison, the same sentence Melinda Loveless received. The judge, in delivering the sentence, spoke about the incomprehensible cruelty of the crime and the need to protect society from someone capable of such violence. Lori showed no reaction. She was 17 years old and would spend the next several decades behind bars. But prison, it seems, changed Lori Tackett. Or at least, she says it did. Over the years, she participated in extensive counseling and psychological treatment. She earned her GED, took college courses, and became involved in prison ministry programs. She expressed remorse in letters to Shanda's family, though they were never acknowledged or accepted. Psychologists who worked with her noted significant progress in her ability to understand and process emotions, to feel empathy, and to comprehend the magnitude of what she'd done. Whether this transformation was genuine or simply a calculated effort to improve her chances at parole is something people still debate. In 2018, after serving 26 years in prison, Lori Tackett was released on parole. The decision was met with immediate outrage. Shanda Scherer's family was devastated, particularly her mother, Jack Vaught, who had fought for years to keep both Melinda and Lori behind bars. Victim advocacy groups condemned the parole board's decision, arguing that the brutality of the crime warranted a life sentence. And the community of Madison, Indiana, was once again forced to confront the horror of what had happened all those years ago. Today, Lori Tackett lives under strict parole conditions, required to check in regularly with authorities and prohibited from contacting Shanda's family or the other girls involved in the crime. She has kept an extremely low profile, avoiding media attention and living quietly in an undisclosed location. She has never given a major interview or offered a detailed public explanation for her actions beyond what she said during legal proceedings. The question that haunts this case is the same one that haunts so many cases of juvenile violence. Can someone who committed such unspeakable acts as a teenager be truly rehabilitated? Lori Tackett was 17 when she participated in the torture and murder of a 12-year-old child. She didn't just go along with someone else's plan. She actively contributed to the horror, and by all accounts, she enjoyed it. Does spending 26 years in prison erase that? Does participating in therapy and expressing remorse make up for what was done? These are questions without easy answers. Questions that force us to confront the limits of forgiveness, the possibility of redemption, and the nature of justice itself. Shanda Scherer died in terror and agony at the age of 12, her life stolen by people she'd considered friends. And while Lori Tackett walks free today, Shanda's family continues to live with the pain of her absence every single day. That's the reality that no amount of rehabilitation can change. Number 7. Hope Rippey. In almost every group crime, there's someone who didn't start the violence, didn't plan the attack, and claims they never wanted anyone to get hurt. Someone who says they were just in the wrong place at the wrong time, swept up in something that spiraled out of control. Hope Rippey has spent decades trying to convince people she was that person, the reluctant participant in the torture and murder of 12-year-old Shanda Scherer on January 11, 1992. But the question that continues to haunt this case is simple and brutal. If you were really innocent, why didn't you stop it? Why didn't you call for help? Why didn't you save her? Hope Anna Rippey was born on March 4, 1976, in New Albany, Indiana, making her just 15 years old when she became involved in one of the most notorious crimes in the state's history. By all accounts, Hope came from a relatively stable home. Her parents were working class, her childhood was unremarkable, and she had no history of violence or serious behavioral problems. She was a typical teenage girl, interested in boys, music, and fitting in with the right crowd. She wasn't particularly close with Melinda Loveless or Lori Tackett, the two ringleaders of the crime, but she knew them through mutual friends and social circles. Hope was quieter than the others, less confrontational, and by her own later admission, easily influenced by stronger personalities. In early January 1992, Hope found herself spending time with Melinda, Lori, and another girl named Toni Lawrence. She knew that Melinda was angry about a younger girl named Shanda Scherer, claiming that Shanda was interfering in her relationship with Amanda Hevron. Hope heard the threats, heard the violent talk, but like so many teenagers, she probably assumed it was just talk, venting and exaggeration, nothing that would actually happen. But on the night of January 11th, when Melinda and Lori started making concrete plans to confront Shanda, Hope made a choice. She could have walked away, could have told her parents, could have warned someone. Instead, she got in the car. Hope would later claim she didn't know what was going to happen, that she thought they were just going to scare Shandaw, maybe rough her up a little. But even if that's true, the moment violence began, she had countless opportunities to stop it, and she didn't. When they arrived at Shandaw's house and knocked on the door, Hope was there. When they lied to Shandaw's parents and convinced them to let their 12-year-old daughter leave with 4 teenage girls she barely knew, Hope went along with it. When Shandaw got in the car, probably excited to be included with older kids, probably completely unaware of the danger she was in, Hope said nothing. Once they drove to a remote location and Melinda pulled out a knife, the night descended into nightmare. Melinda attacked first, stabbing Shandaw repeatedly while the child screamed and begged for her life. Lori joined in, beating Shandaw with a tire iron, strangling her, escalating the violence to unthinkable levels. And Hope Rippey sat in the car and watched. She would later testify that she was terrified, that she didn't know what to do, that she was afraid Melinda and Lori would turn on her if she tried to intervene. But here's the thing. At multiple points throughout that horrific night, Hope had chances to get help. When they stopped at a gas station to buy drinks and snacks while Shandaw lay bleeding in the trunk, Hope could have run inside and told the clerk. When they drove past other cars, past houses with lights on, past payphones, she could have done something. But she didn't. She stayed silent. The torture went on for hours. They drove around with Shandaw in the trunk, stopping periodically to inflict more pain, pouring drain cleaner on her wounds, beating her again, terrorizing her. Hope was present for all of it. She didn't participate in the physical violence, but she also didn't try to stop it. At one point, according to later testimony, Shandaw weakly called out from the trunk, begging for water, begging them to let her go, promising she wouldn't tell anyone what happened. The girls discussed whether to give her something to drink. They decided against it. Hope said nothing in Shandaw's defense. Finally, in the early morning hours, they drove to a remote field. Lori and Melinda pulled Shandaw's broken body from the trunk. The 12-year-old was barely conscious, her body covered in burns, stab wounds, and bruises. And then they poured gasoline over her and set her on fire. Some evidence suggests Shandaw was still alive when the flames started. Hope Rippey watched from the car. She would later say she closed her eyes, that she couldn't bear to watch. But she didn't scream for them to stop. She didn't run for help. She just sat there. And when it was over, when Shandaw Scherer was burning to death in that field, Hope got back in the car with the others, and they drove to McDonald's for breakfast. When police began investigating Shandaw's murder the next day, it didn't take long for them to identify the 4 girls involved. And Hope Rippey, consumed by guilt and horror at what she'd witnessed, was one of the first to break. She contacted authorities and offered to cooperate, providing detailed testimony about what had happened that night. Her account was crucial to the prosecution's case, giving them the timeline and specifics they needed to secure convictions. Hope described the torture in graphic detail, identified who did what, and painted a clear picture of Melinda and Lori as the primary perpetrators. She portrayed herself as a frightened bystander who had been too afraid to intervene. But here's where things get complicated. The prosecution believed Hope's cooperation was genuine, that she was a lesser participant who had been swept up in something beyond her control. Her defense attorneys argued that she was a victim herself, a terrified 15-year-old girl who had witnessed something traumatic and hadn't known how to respond. But others, including Shandaw's family and some investigators, saw it differently. They argued that Hope had multiple opportunities to save Shandaw's life and chose not to. They pointed out that silence, in a situation like this, isn't innocence. It's complicity. Even if Hope didn't swing the tire iron or light the match, she was there for all of it, and her failure to act contributed directly to Shandaw's death. Hope Rippey was charged as an adult with murder, criminal confinement, and arson, just like the others. But because of her cooperation with prosecutors, she was offered a plea deal. In 1993, she pleaded guilty to criminal confinement and arson in exchange for the murder charge being dropped. She was sentenced to 60 years in prison, but with significant time reduced for her cooperation and good behavior, she would ultimately serve far less than the others. Hope served her time quietly. Unlike Melinda and Lori, who required years of intensive therapy and psychological treatment, Hope was described by prison officials as a model inmate. She participated in counseling, earned her GED, stayed out of trouble, and expressed deep remorse for what had happened. She wrote letters to Shandaw's family, letters that were never answered and never will be. In 2006, after serving just 14 years in prison, Hope Rippey was released on parole. She was 30 years old. Her release sparked controversy, though not to the same degree as Melinda's or Lori's eventual releases. Some people believed Hope had paid her debt to society, that she had been a frightened teenager caught up in something terrible, and that she deserved a second chance. Others, particularly Shandaw's mother Jacques Vaught, felt that 14 years was nowhere near enough for someone who had stood by and watched a 12-year-old child be tortured to death. Jacques has spoken publicly about the pain of knowing that all 4 girls who were involved in her daughter's murder eventually walked free, while Shandaw never got to grow up, never got to experience life beyond that horrible night. Today, Hope Rippey lives under a new name in an undisclosed location. She has stayed completely out of the public eye, avoided media attention, and by all accounts has tried to build a quiet, anonymous life. She has never given an interview, never offered a detailed public explanation for her actions beyond what she testified to during legal proceedings. We don't know if she has a family, a career, or friends who know about her past. We don't know if she thinks about Shanda Sharer every day, or if she's managed to compartmentalize that night and move on. What we do know is this: Hope Rippey was 15 years old when she got in a car with 3 other girls and participated, even passively, in one of the most brutal crimes imaginable. She had opportunities to save a life and chose not to take them. Whether that makes her a victim of circumstance or a willing participant is something people will debate forever. But for Shanda Sharer's family, the answer is clear. Hope Rippey may not have been the one who swung the tire iron or lit the match, but she was there. She watched it happen, and she did nothing. In the end, maybe that's the most disturbing part of Hope Rippey's story. Not what she did, but what she didn't do. Because sometimes, the silence of a witness can be just as deadly as the actions of a perpetrator, and no amount of cooperation, no amount of remorse, no number of years in prison can change the fact that when a 12-year-old girl was dying, Hope Rippey stayed silent. Number 8. Tony Lawrence. In the hierarchy of culpability surrounding the murder of 12-year-old Shandaw Sharer, Tony Lawrence occupies the most ambiguous position. She was the youngest of the 4 girls involved, the least connected to the others, and by most accounts, the most reluctant participant. But she was still there. She still got in that car. She still watched a child die. And the question that haunts her case, that haunts anyone who learns her story, is this: at what point does being young, scared, and passive stop being an excuse and start being a choice? Tony Lawrence was born on September 12, 1975, in the Louisville, Kentucky area, making her just 16 years old, when she became involved in one of Indiana's most notorious crimes. Unlike Melinda Loveless, who came from an abusive home, or Lori Tackett, who exhibited disturbing behavior from an early age, Tony's background was remarkably ordinary. She grew up in a working-class family, had no history of violence, no criminal record, and no indication that she would ever be involved in anything like what happened on January 11th, 1992. By all accounts, she was a quiet, somewhat shy teenager who struggled to fit in and often went along with what others wanted to avoid conflict or rejection. Toni knew Hope Rippey through social circles, and through Hope, she met Melinda Loveless and Lori Tackett in the weeks leading up to the murder. She wasn't close with either of them. They were acquaintances at best. But in January 1992, when Melinda and Lori began planning to confront Shanda Sharer, Toni found herself invited along. She would later testify that she had no idea what they were planning, that she thought they were just going out for a drive, maybe to hang out and talk. She claimed she didn't know about the violence Melinda and Lori were plotting. And maybe that's true. But even if it is, the moment she realized what was happening, she made a choice to stay. On the night of January 11th, Toni got in the car with Melinda, Lori, and Hope. They drove to Shanda Sharer's house, and Toni was there when they knocked on the door and lied to Shanda's parents, convincing them to let their 12-year-old daughter leave with 4 teenage girls she barely knew. Toni saw Shanda get excited, saw her trust them, saw her climb into the car without any sense of danger. And Toni said nothing. According to later testimony, Toni sat in the front passenger seat for most of the night, the furthest away from the violence that would unfold in the back seat and later in the trunk. But distance doesn't equal innocence. When they reached a remote location and Melinda pulled out a knife, Toni realized this wasn't just a confrontation. This was something far worse. Melinda attacked Shanda, stabbing her repeatedly while the 12-year-old screamed and begged for her life. Lori joined in, beating Shanda with a tire iron, escalating the brutality. Hope sat frozen, and Toni, in the front seat, turned away. She would later testify that she couldn't watch, that she was terrified, that she didn't know what to do. But here's the critical question. Why didn't she do anything? When they stopped at a gas station while Shanda lay bleeding in the trunk, why didn't Toni run inside and scream for help? When they drove past houses, past other cars, past every opportunity to intervene, why did she stay silent? The torture continued for hours. They drove around with Shanda in the trunk, stopping periodically to inflict more pain. At one point, Lori poured drain cleaner on Shanda's wounds while the child cried out in agony. Toni was in the car the entire time. She heard the screams. She heard Shanda begging. According to testimony, at one point, Shanda weakly called out from the trunk, asking for water, pleading to be let go. The girls discussed what to do. Toni reportedly suggested they should just leave Shanda somewhere and drive away, not out of compassion necessarily, but perhaps out of fear of what was happening, fear of how far it had gone. But Melinda and Lori refused. They weren't done yet. Finally, in the early morning hours of January 12th, they drove to a remote field. Melinda and Lori pulled Shanda's broken, barely conscious body from the trunk. They doused her with gasoline and set her on fire. Toni Lawrence was there. She watched from the car as a 12-year-old child burned to death, and then, like the others, she got back in the car and went to McDonald's for breakfast. They sat in the restaurant, eating and talking as if nothing had happened. Toni didn't run. She didn't call the police. She just went home and tried to pretend the night hadn't happened. But it had happened. And within days, the guilt and horror began eating away at her. When police started investigating Shanda's murder, Toni, like Hope, broke quickly. She contacted authorities and agreed to cooperate, providing detailed testimony about what had occurred. Her account corroborated Hope's and gave prosecutors the complete picture they needed. Toni described the events of that night in painful detail, identifying Melinda and Lori as the primary attackers and portraying herself and Hope as terrified witnesses who hadn't known what to do. The question prosecutors and the public had to grapple with was, How culpable is someone who doesn't participate in violence, but also doesn't try to stop it? Toni Lawrence didn't stab Shanda. She didn't beat her with a tire iron. She didn't pour gasoline and light the match. But she was present for all of it. She had opportunities to save Shanda's life, opportunities that she didn't take. Her defense attorneys argued that she was a frightened 16-year-old who had been in over her head, who had frozen in fear and hadn't known how to respond. They painted her as another victim of Melinda and Lori's violence, someone who had been traumatized by what she witnessed. The prosecution, while acknowledging that Toni was less culpable than Melinda or Lori, still believed she bore responsibility. They argued that her silence enabled the crime, that her failure to seek help contributed to Shanda's death, and that she needed to be held accountable. But they also recognized that Toni's cooperation had been essential to building their case against the primary perpetrators. In 1993, Toni Lawrence was charged as an adult with criminal confinement and other offenses. Because of her age, her limited involvement in the actual violence, and her cooperation with authorities, she was offered a lenient plea deal. She pleaded guilty and was sentenced to 20 years in prison, significantly less than the 60-year sentences Melinda and Lori received, and less than Hope's sentence before time reductions. Toni served her time quietly in Indiana's juvenile and adult correctional facilities. Prison officials described her as remorseful, cooperative, and deeply affected by what she had witnessed. She participated in counseling and educational programs, expressing genuine horror at what had happened. Unlike some of the others, who took years to show remorse, Toni seemed to understand almost immediately the gravity of what had occurred. She wrote letters to Shanda's family, though like the others, she never received a response. In 2000, after serving just 8 years in prison, Toni Lawrence was released on parole. She was 24 years old, younger than Shanda would ever get to be. Her release was relatively quiet, without the media attention that would later surround the releases of Melinda, Lori, and Hope. Toni had been the youngest, the least involved, and the first to be freed. Some people believed justice had been served appropriately, that Toni had been punished for her role but not held to the same standard as those who had actively tortured and killed. Others, including Shanda's family, felt that 8 years was nowhere near enough for someone who had stood by and watched a child die. Today, Toni Lawrence lives under a different name in an undisclosed location. She has maintained complete anonymity since her release, avoiding any media attention or public discussion of the case. We don't know what her life looks like now, whether she has a family, a career, or people who know about her past. We don't know if she thinks about Shanda Sharer every day or if she's managed to move on. What we do know is that she was given something Shanda never got, a second chance at life. Toni Lawrence's story raises uncomfortable questions about responsibility, culpability, and the nature of participation in crime. She wasn't the one who planned the murder. She wasn't the one who inflicted the violence, but she was there. She watched it happen, and she didn't stop it. In the eyes of the law, that made her guilty. In the eyes of Shanda's family, that made her complicit. And in her own eyes, well, we can only imagine what Toni Lawrence sees when she looks in the mirror. The tragedy of Shanda Sharer's murder isn't just about the 4 girls who killed her. It's about the moments when intervention could have changed everything. Every time they stopped at a gas station, every time they passed another car, every time Shanda cried out from the trunk. Those were moments when someone could have saved her. Toni Lawrence was there for all of those moments. She heard those cries. She saw those opportunities, and she let them pass. Maybe she was scared. Maybe she was frozen. Maybe she genuinely didn't know what to do. But a 12-year-old girl died because no one in that car decided her life was worth the risk of speaking up. And that silence, That terrible, deadly silence is something Toni Lawrence will carry with her for the rest of her life, whether she speaks about it or not. Number 9. Bernadette McNeely. There are crimes that shock us because of their brutality. There are crimes that disturb us because of their senselessness. And then there are crimes like the torture and murder of 16-year-old Suzanne Capper in December 1992 that force us to confront something even more terrifying. The capacity for ordinary people to commit acts of unimaginable cruelty, not in a moment of rage or passion, but slowly, deliberately, over days of sustained torture. At the center of this nightmare was Bernadette McNeely, a woman whose sadistic treatment of a vulnerable teenager would become one of the most horrifying cases in British criminal history. Bernadette McNeely was born in 1965 in Manchester, England, into a working-class family in one of the city's rougher neighborhoods. Her childhood was marked by instability, poverty, and dysfunction. She grew up in an environment where violence was commonplace, where abuse was normalized, and where empathy seemed to be in short supply. By her 20s, Bernadette had developed a reputation in her neighborhood as someone you didn't cross, loud, aggressive, and quick to violence. She had a string of failed relationships, struggled to maintain employment, and seemed to bounce from one chaotic living situation to another. She had children, but was reportedly an inconsistent and neglectful mother, often leaving them in the care of others while she went out drinking or causing trouble. By 1992, Bernadette was living in a rundown house at 97 Langworthy Road in Moston, Manchester, with her boyfriend and several other people who drifted in and out. The house had become something of a gathering place for local troublemakers, a place where drugs were used, where stolen goods were fenced, and where violence simmered just beneath the surface. Neighbors described it as a problem house, the kind of place where screams and shouting were so common that people eventually stopped paying attention. It was in this toxic environment that 16-year-old Suzanne Capper found herself in December 1992, and it would be the last place she'd ever know. Suzanne was a vulnerable teenager from a troubled background. She'd had a difficult childhood, bounced between family members and care situations, and was desperate for acceptance and belonging. She'd become acquainted with the people at 97 Langworthy Road, and, despite the dysfunction, saw them as something like friends. She would visit the house, sometimes stay over, trying to fit in with a group that saw her not as a friend but as a target. Bernadette McNeely, in particular, seemed to view Suzanne with contempt. She mocked her, belittled her, and gradually began subjecting her to increasingly cruel treatment. What started as verbal abuse and humiliation would, over the course of several days in December 1992, escalate into torture that defies comprehension. On December 7, 1992, Suzanne Capper was effectively taken prisoner in the house on Langworthy Road. What followed over the next 7 days was a sustained campaign of torture so brutal that even experienced detectives would later struggle to describe it without breaking down. Bernadette McNeely was the primary orchestrator and most enthusiastic participant in the abuse. Suzanne was stripped, tied to a bed, and subjected to relentless physical and psychological torture. Bernadette burned her with cigarettes, beat her with various objects, and cut her with knives. She injected Suzanne with substances to keep her weak and disoriented. She pulled out clumps of Suzanne's hair and laughed while doing it. But the physical torture was only part of the horror. Bernadette subjected Suzanne to psychological torment that was equally cruel. She forced Suzanne to listen to recordings of demonic chanting and horror soundtracks at full volume for hours on end, creating an atmosphere of complete terror. She made Suzanne repeat phrases humiliating herself. She taunted her, told her no one cared about her, that she was worthless, that no one would miss her when she was gone. And perhaps most disturbing of all, Bernadette seemed to enjoy it. Witnesses who were in the house during this time would later testify that Bernadette appeared gleeful, that she laughed while inflicting pain, that she seemed energized by Suzanne's suffering. Other people were present in the house during Suzanne's captivity. Some participated in the abuse, others watched passively, but no one helped her. No one called the police, no one intervened. The torture continued day after day, with Bernadette leading the assault. She poured petrol over parts of Suzanne's body and threatened to set her alight. She stubbed cigarettes out on her skin dozens of times. She beat her so severely that Suzanne's face became almost unrecognizable. And through it all, Suzanne begged for mercy, begged to be let go, promised she wouldn't tell anyone. But Bernadette had no intention of letting her go. By December 14th, Suzanne was barely alive. Her body was covered in burns, cuts, and bruises. She had lost teeth from the beatings. She was emaciated, dehydrated, and in shock. And that's when Bernadette and the others decided they needed to get rid of her. They forced Suzanne, who could barely walk, into a car and drove her to a remote area near Rumilly. They dragged her to a patch of waste ground, doused her in petrol, and set her on fire. Then they drove away, leaving her to burn to death. But Suzanne Capper didn't die immediately. Despite burns covering 90% of her body, despite everything she had endured, she somehow managed to put out the flames and drag herself to the side of a road. A passing motorist found her in the early morning hours and called for help. When paramedics arrived, they were horrified by what they saw. Suzanne was barely recognizable as human. Her skin was charred, her body was broken, and she should have been dead. But she was conscious, and she was able to speak. In the ambulance and later at the hospital, Suzanne told the authorities what had happened. She named her attackers. She described the torture. She gave them the address of the house on Langworthy Road. Police immediately launched an investigation and within hours had arrested Bernadette McNeely and 5 others who had been involved in the abuse. Suzanne held on for 4 more days, fighting for life with incredible strength. But on December 18th, 1992, her body finally gave out. She was 16 years old. The investigation revealed the full extent of the horror that had taken place in that house. Police found evidence of the torture, bloodstains, recording equipment used to terrorize Suzanne, restraints, and instruments used to inflict pain. Witnesses came forward describing what they had seen and heard, and Bernadette McNeely's role as the primary torturer became undeniable. She had orchestrated the abuse, participated enthusiastically, and shown no remorse even after her arrest. Bernadette and 5 others were charged with murder and various torture-related offenses. The trial began in 1993 and shocked the nation. The details that emerged were so horrific that the judge warned the jury about the disturbing nature of the evidence they would hear. Bernadette's defense attempted to argue that she had been under the influence of drugs, that she had mental health issues, that others had been equally responsible. But the evidence was overwhelming. Witnesses testified that Bernadette had been the driving force behind the torture, that she had seemed to take pleasure in Suzanne's suffering, and that she had shown no mercy even when Suzanne begged for her life. In November 1993, Bernadette McNeely was found guilty of murder. The judge, in sentencing, described the crime as one of the most horrific he had ever encountered. He spoke of the sustained cruelty, the complete lack of humanity, and the suffering inflicted on a vulnerable young girl who had trusted the wrong people. Bernadette McNeely was sentenced to life imprisonment with a minimum term of 25 years. The other participants received varying sentences based on their level of involvement, but Bernadette, as the ringleader, received the harshest punishment. She remained in prison for over 2 decades, serving time in various facilities across England. Reports from prison officials described her as difficult, manipulative, and showing limited progress in rehabilitation programs. She maintained that she had been blamed unfairly, that others had been equally responsible, and that her role had been exaggerated. She showed little genuine remorse for what had happened to Suzanne Capper. In 2015, after serving 21 years behind bars, Bernadette McNeely was released on parole. The decision sparked immediate outrage. Suzanne's family was devastated, feeling that 21 years was nowhere near enough for someone who had tortured a teenager to death over 7 days. Victim advocacy groups condemned the parole board's decision, and the community that remembered Suzanne's case was horrified that her killer was walking free. Today, Bernadette McNeely lives under a new identity in an undisclosed location, subject to lifelong parole conditions. She has been given anonymity to protect her from vigilante justice, a decision that further angered those who believe she should face public accountability for her crimes. We don't know what her life looks like now, whether she has relationships, employment, or people who know about her past. She has never given a public interview or offered a detailed explanation for her actions beyond what she said during legal proceedings. The murder of Suzanne Capper remains one of the most disturbing cases in British criminal history, not just because of the brutality, but because of what it reveals about human nature. Bernadette McNeely wasn't a stranger who abducted Suzanne off the street. She was someone Suzanne knew, someone Suzanne had trusted, and over 7 days, Bernadette systematically destroyed that trust along with Suzanne's body. She didn't kill in a moment of rage. She didn't act out of desperation. She tortured a child slowly, methodically, and with apparent enjoyment. Suzanne Capper died in agony, betrayed by people she thought were friends, failed by a system that should have protected her. And Bernadette McNeely, the woman who orchestrated her suffering, served 21 years and walked free. That's the reality that still haunts everyone who knows this case, because sometimes the monsters don't stay locked away. Sometimes they get second chances that their victims never had. Number 10. Miguel Ricard, Spain, 1992. 2 teenage girls vanished without a trace, setting off one of the most intensive missing persons investigations the country had ever seen. When the truth finally emerged, it revealed a crime so depraved, so calculated, and so horrifying that it would shake Spanish society to its core and change the nation's laws forever. At the heart of this nightmare was Miguel Ricard, a young man whose participation in the kidnapping, torture, and murder of Miriam Garcia Iborra and Antonia Gomez Rodriguez would earn him a place among Spain's most reviled criminals. But here's what makes his story particularly chilling. He wasn't the mastermind. He was the accomplice, the willing participant who could have stopped it all but chose not to. Miguel Ricard Tarragona was born on June 19, 1971, in the Valencia region of Spain. He grew up in Catarroja, a working-class town, where opportunities were limited and futures often looked predetermined. Miguel's childhood was marked by instability and dysfunction. His family struggled financially, and by his teenage years, Miguel had already begun showing troubling behavior. He had difficulty in school, clashed with authority figures, and developed a reputation for petty criminal activity. By his early 20s, he had racked up minor offenses and had become known to local police as someone who ran with a rough crowd. But nothing in his background suggested he would become involved in something as monstrous as what happened in November 1992. In the early 90s, Miguel fell into the orbit of a man named Antonio Angles, and that association would define the rest of his life. Angles was older, more charismatic, and far more dangerous. He had a way of drawing people in, of making them feel like they were part of something exciting. Miguel, directionless and easily influenced, became something of a follower. He looked up to Angles, sought his approval, and gradually became willing to do things he might never have considered on his own. By late 1992, the two men were spending significant time together, and Anglais was beginning to talk about darker fantasies, about violence, about control, about doing something that would make them feel powerful. Miguel listened. And when Anglais started making concrete plans, Miguel didn't walk away. On the evening of November 13th, 1992, 14-year-old Miriam Garcia Iborra and 15-year-old Antonia Gomez Rodriguez left their homes in Alcácer, a small town near Valencia, to attend a local festival. They were excited, dressed up, and looking forward to a night of music and fun with friends. They never made it to the festival. Somewhere along their route, they encountered Antonio Anglais and Miguel Ricard. What exactly was said to convince the girls to get into a vehicle with the two men remains unclear, but within minutes, Miriam and Antonia's night of fun had become a nightmare they would never escape. Anglais and Ricard drove the girls to an abandoned building in a remote area called La Romana. Once there, the two men held the teenagers captive and subjected them to hours of sexual violence and torture. Miguel Ricard was there for all of it. He participated. He didn't orchestrate the attack. That was Anglais. But he was an active, willing participant. The girls begged for their lives, pleaded to be let go, promised they wouldn't tell anyone. But neither man showed mercy. When Anglais and Ricard had finished with their assault, they made the decision to ensure the girls could never identify them. They executed both teenagers, shooting them and leaving their bodies in the abandoned building before setting it on fire in an attempt to destroy evidence. For 75 days, Miriam and Antonia were simply missing. Their families held out hope, launched massive search efforts, pleaded on television for any information about their daughter's whereabouts. The case gripped Spain, with thousands of volunteers joining search parties and the media providing constant coverage. But as weeks turned into months with no sign of the girls, hope began to fade. Then, on January 27, 1993, a beekeeper discovered the bodies in the abandoned building at La Romana. The discovery sent shockwaves through Spain. When forensic evidence revealed what had been done to the girls, the nation was consumed with rage and grief. The investigation moved swiftly. Evidence at the scene led police to Antonio Anglais and Miguel Ricard. Anglais disappeared before he could be arrested, sparking one of the most intensive manhunts in Spanish history. But Miguel Ricard was found and arrested within days. When confronted with the evidence, he initially denied involvement, but as the forensic case against him became undeniable, he began to talk. He confessed to being present during the attacks, admitted to participating in the violence, but tried to minimize his role by placing most of the blame on Anglais. He portrayed himself as someone who had been pressured, who had been afraid to refuse, who had gone along with something that spiraled out of control. But the evidence told a different story. This wasn't a crime of impulse or coercion. This was calculated, sustained brutality that lasted for hours, and Miguel Ricard had been an active participant throughout. The trial of Miguel Ricard began in 1994 and became a national obsession. Every day, the courthouse was surrounded by angry crowds calling for justice, calling for the harshest possible punishment. Inside the courtroom, the prosecution presented overwhelming evidence of Ricard's guilt, forensic evidence linking him to the scene, testimony establishing his relationship with Anglais, and his own confession detailing what had happened that night. The defense attempted to argue that Ricard had been under Anglais' influence, that he had been a follower rather than a leader, and that he deserved some consideration for his cooperation. But the brutality of the crime and the suffering inflicted on two innocent teenagers left little room for sympathy. In September 1994, Miguel Ricard was found guilty of kidnapping, sexual assault, and murder. He was sentenced to 170 years in prison. the maximum penalty available under Spanish law at the time. The families of Miriam and Antonia wept in the courtroom, finally having some measure of justice, though nothing could bring their daughters back. But there was one frustrating piece missing. Antonio Anglés had never been found. Despite an international manhunt, despite reported sightings across Europe and beyond, he remained a fugitive. Some believe he died shortly after fleeing, possibly drowning while attempting to stow away on a ship. Others believe he's still alive, living under a false identity somewhere in the world. To this day, he has never been captured, never been tried, never been held accountable. Miguel Ricard spent the next decades in Spanish prisons, and his case became a catalyst for significant legal changes in Spain. The horrific nature of the Alcácer murders led to reforms in how violent crimes were prosecuted and sentenced, particularly crimes against children. The case also sparked national conversations about victim rights, criminal justice, and the handling of missing persons investigations. Ricard became one of Spain's most hated prisoners, requiring protective custody due to threats from other inmates. Reports from prison officials described him as someone who struggled with the reality of spending the rest of his life behind bars, who oscillated between expressing remorse and making excuses for his actions. In 2013, after serving 19 years in prison, Miguel Ricard became eligible for parole under Spanish law, despite his original 170-year sentence. The possibility of his release sparked immediate and intense public outrage. The families of Miriam and Antonia fought desperately to keep him imprisoned, arguing that he remained dangerous and that releasing him would be a betrayal of their daughter's memory. Victim advocacy groups mobilized, gathering signatures and organizing protests. But in 2013, Miguel Ricard was released on parole, subject to strict conditions including GPS monitoring, prohibitions on leaving certain areas, and requirements to check in regularly with authorities. His release was met with fury. Thousands took to the streets in protest. The families of the victims felt betrayed by a justice system that allowed someone who had participated in such horrific crimes to walk free after less than 20 years. And the Spanish public, who had never forgotten the Alcácer murders, was horrified that one of the killers was now living among them. Ricard was given a new identity and relocated to an undisclosed location to protect him from vigilante justice, a decision that only amplified the anger. Today, Miguel Ricard lives as a free man somewhere in Spain, his exact whereabouts known only to authorities. He has maintained a low profile, avoided media attention, and has never given a detailed public account of his actions beyond what he testified to during legal proceedings. He remains one of the most despised figures in Spanish criminal history, a man whose name is synonymous with one of the nation's darkest moments. The Alcácer case fundamentally changed Spain. It exposed vulnerabilities in how missing persons cases were handled, led to significant legal reforms, and created a lasting cultural trauma that persists more than 3 decades later. Miriam Garcia Iborra and Antonia Gomez Rodriguez were just 14 and 15 years old when their lives were stolen. They were going to a party. They should have come home safe. Instead, they encountered 2 men who saw them not as human beings, but as victims to be exploited and destroyed. Miguel Ricard's story forces us to confront an uncomfortable truth about accomplices in violent crime. He wasn't the mastermind. He wasn't the one who planned the attack. But he was there. He participated. He had opportunities to stop it, to call for help, to let those girls go. And he chose not to. He chose to be part of something monstrous. And while Antonio Anglés may have been the primary perpetrator, Miguel Ricard's willing participation made him equally responsible for the deaths of 2 innocent girls. The question that still haunts this case is the same one that haunts so many stories of accomplices. If you're not strong enough to say no, if you're not brave enough to stop it, if you're willing to participate in evil just because someone else is leading, does that make you any less guilty? Miguel Ricard spent 19 years in prison trying to answer that question. And for the families of Miriam and Antonia, for the nation of Spain that still remembers their names, the answer is clear. No. It doesn't make you any less guilty. It just makes you a coward as well as a killer.